You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players, and all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back to episode 11 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Today we'll be talking about making the transition from Blitz to Classic Constructed. With Skirmish Season 2 wrapping up and drawing to a close, all eyes are on Road to National Season, which has already been confirmed Classic Constructed. So it's about time to refocus and start preparing. But first, Hayden, how are you doing and what have you been playing this past week?
Hey, Brendan. Yeah, I'm good. Been able to get in a bit of flesh and blood this week, which has been fantastic. Started with the past weekend. I was able to draft some Monarch at one of my local stores. Drafted a Levia deck that I ended up going 2-1 with, losing to a Prism deck, actually played by Roy. If anyone saw any of the coverage from the Auckland Calling, Roy made top 8 of the event, did a fantastic job, and plays it at the local store that I go to often. So he beat me up with a nice Luminaris Prism deck. And then was able to play some Classic Constructed earlier this week as well. So got in some games with Chain and actually lost to a Prism there as well. So Prism's been beating me up this week. But Brendan, what about you?
Yeah, I played a little bit of Flesh and Blood. No, I'm kidding. I played like 7 Armouries last week and 3 Skirmishes. I just had a really light work week, and I don't know. I just decided to kind of get into it. Played a bunch of EU Armories and then the US Armories at night, which is jamming games. And then I played a skirmish on Friday, 2 skirmishes on Saturday, and nothing on Sunday. But I think so. If we count Friday and Saturday together, I played 24 rounds of skirmish. And that's because I top-aided all 3 of them. So the first one was a bit smaller. It was a Canada-based one. There's around 40 players, I think. I played Kano, top-aided, and then I lost in the quarters to Sharif, a player from the UK. He was on Warrior. It was one of those situations where I went first, then he did the old Iron Song Determination, Steel Blade Supremacy, Singing Steel Blade. So I started on, I don't know, I think it was like 5 or 7. We ended up getting it 1-to-1 health, but I wasn't able to close it out. So it was a lot closer than I expected. It was because he ended up drawing an entire red hand after that. So, you know, that speaks to the kind of playing to your outs. Because as soon as I saw that, I was like, dude, come on. But yeah, then I got up on Saturday. I played Fable Hobby. That one was about 107 players. I played Kano again, top-aided that one, and then lost in the quarters again to Tower number 9 on Shane. That addition of the Spell Void Hood has been very tough for Kano, in my opinion. So had him at 11, actually had the Stir Fork combo for 14. He had Null Rune 3. Just couldn't chip in that next 2 damage. He hit me for it was like almost more than 15 on the first turn. Then after that, I just couldn't close it out. And then after that skirmish, about 30 minutes after it, I played Fabled Collections, which for some ungodly reason was 8 rounds of Swiss, and I decided to play Dorinthia. I regret that deeply. It was very boring. So I was like, oh man, I played a lot of Kano. Maybe I just turn off my brain and play Dorinthia. And yeah, I just did not have a fun time, but I top-aided that one and then lost in the semifinals to Dante on Ira. But yeah, it was a crazy weekend. I think I gained over 100 XP in 2 days. It was just, it was a lot, but it was fun. And I definitely wish I had stayed on the Kano for the last one.
We'll get some experience with Dorinthia. Bring her back for a little bit. I noticed some pretty big names there in your losses. So no slouches that you got taken out of top 8, but 3 top 8s is fantastic. So congrats and congrats to the winners of those events. Brendan, usually we'd go into the news and then into our Commander Cookout, our correspondence section. But instead this week, I want to actually flip some questions on you based on Skirmish Season 2 and your experience, especially this past weekend. One of the big things I wanted to ask you is what has been your sort of key takeaway as a player and your learnings playing Kano over the past few weeks, or just playing in skirmishes and the Blitz format in general?
Yeah, so we can talk about my decision to play Kano. So I think that playing Season 1 and now coming into Season 2, Kano, like my biggest kind of gripe with season 1 is I would go through these really long events. Sometimes they end up being like 10, 11 rounds after top 8 had finished. And I would only really kind of feel like I had like 2 games that I may be able to take something away from. But that's just the nature of Blitz. Like you can be really consistent on some decks. But yeah, I didn't really like that experience. Just kind of having some of these non-games. So coming into season 2, I think Kano is it's about, I mean, it didn't get any stronger, right? So it's probably just in slightly a worse spot because Prism is just a really hard matchup. And Chain's a bit tough as well, but I don't think that it's necessarily Chain fair. But the reason why I chose Kano was I think that Kano's kind of the only hero in Blitz where you can learn every single game to game. Um, it's the skill floor. People talk about the skill floor being high. Yeah, it's high. Like your first 50 games on Kano really suck, but then you get to handle it. You get the hand of it. The hand of it, and then you understand the lines, the combos. But then as you kind of keep progressing and keep playing Kano, you realize that it's almost like one of those things like the more you know, the less you know. The deck itself is so dynamic. And I mean, I've changed the deck so many times. Like I've played like a red liner deck, 16 blues, played like heavy blues. I've cut Lesson in Lava. I've cut Tome of the Aetherwind, put them back in, played the Reverberates, like all this stuff. And yeah, I just think that there's so much to kind of keep improving on game to game as Kano. And that's really my favorite part about it. As well as speaking to, kind of when I talked about like my issue with season 1 is that I feel like I'd have some of these non-games. I think that, one thing about Kano is that the skill level of your opponent is it's almost irrelevant. Like if they can definitely mess it up, right? If they don't play enough Null Ruin or they don't pitch correctly or they just take damage unnecessarily, then yeah, then those games end up being like, non-games, like I said. But for the most part, you're kind of goldfishing the deck, and I call it Kano Solitaire. It's a terrible experience for the opponent. I understand. Basically no interaction. But because of that, you basically get to improve and learn every single game because everything is a challenge, I think, when you're kind of on that deck and you can find these new lines, find these new outs. And my favorite part about the deck is playing to very, very hard outs, like going very, very low. Just when it looks like you're guaranteed to lose the game, there can be some really convoluted ways to come out of that. Like I had one the other day where I had to, I blocked 3 cards and I had to Tunic, Boots, Tome of the Aetherwind and draw 2 cards and block for 6. And then I ended up being able to close out the game when not only I blocked my whole hand, I also used my freaking boots to block. But yeah, I think it's a game where you can play to your outs and constantly learn. So that's why I've committed to Kano. Yep. And I think it's also an incredibly strong deck. Like, let's be real.
Sure. And the second part of my question for you, in our correspondence section this week, questions from Hayden, is how have the new heroes from Monarch changed the Blitz format, in your opinion, over your experience with Skirmish?
Yeah, so I think Shane is a bit warping to the meta, and not in a bad way, but in the sense that there's significantly less Dorinthias. At the tail end of season 1 there, I think we were getting close to 70% Dorinthia, like some of these international skirmishes or more NA-centered skirmishes, just tons of Dorinthia players. Now, not so much. Dorinthia, Tall Warrior really just has a bad matchup in the Shane. The Carrion Husk is like a time walk for Dorinthia, so I've seen a lot of Dorinthia players, transition over to Prism, and maybe some other decks. But even with these ones I played this past weekend, generally it was around 35% Ira, which is low. Like that's pretty low for Ira. And then Kano was significantly represented. I think that the Kano numbers are bumped because a lot of these players that are grinding skirmish nowadays are from just from Asia in general. So it used to just be Singaporeans from what I understood, but now there's like a lot of really talented players coming out of Hong Kong, a few in Malaysia as well. And they're just absolutely grinding and putting up a ton of results. And a lot of them play Kano, like a lot more of that region, I think like proportionately plays Kano than North America. So our Kano, like the Kano representation in these skirmishes was like up like 20%, which is unheard of for skirmish. But yeah, we saw a really healthy break. Like 35% Ira, 20% Kano, 20% Dorinthia, and then like 10% on like all the other stuff. But yeah, it's been really interesting, really enjoyable, and I feel like I've had a lot of really good experiences, really good games, and I've improved a lot as a player.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Hayden, for the question there. And if you do want to get your question in for our Command and Cookout, our correspondence section, make sure you email us through to arsenalpassfab@gmail.com, or you can just drop a comment in the video. We'll see your questions, and we'll back with a listener question next week that isn't me.
All right, and with that, we'll head into the news. Hayden, why don't you take it away?
Yep, definitely. So, Brendan, 3 skirmishes under your belt this past weekend. We're heading into the final weekend of Skirmish Season 2. We've got 2 pretty big skirmishes coming up, with Red Riot Games in Canada hosting their massive online skirmish event this week, I believe with additional cash prizes as well. I know there's a lot of people from, as you say, around the world who have been attracted to enter and to play this event because of the prizing. So it sounds like it's going to be a pretty big event. With a lot of good players. At the same time, we've got the Channel Fireball skirmish as well, which I'll personally be playing in. I know a few players playing in that as well. So I believe there's still entry for that one, but not so much for, I believe, Red Riot sold out. But you can still get into the Channel Fireball skirmish if you like. We'll post the link to the event in the description of the show. And I'd love to get some shout outs in the comments. What should I play? I haven't actually chosen a deck for this weekend. So if people have any ideas on what they think I should play for the CFB skirmish, let me know. I'll tell you right now, I won't play Dardadol. But
you will play Azalea, so that's good to know.
I'm not opposed to it, but I'd love some suggestions.
So you would, I love that you wouldn't play Dardadol, but you'd play Captain without Drone of Brutality. That would be a painful one.
Yeah, good point. Maybe I wouldn't play Captain either. Well, anyway, I'm not saying that I will take the final suggestions of our great listeners, but I will take it into consideration.
Yeah, I just want to make a small correction there. I do believe that Red Riot is uncapped.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would have to recheck, but I think it's at like 150 right now. So that makes me think it is uncapped. I know that deck submissions are actually, well, when you hear this pod, they were yesterday. So they are tonight for when we're recording. Mm-hmm. So maybe it will be too late to sign up after that.
Okay. Well, either way, whatever is available, we'll drop some descriptions in the show notes so you can check them out. Get in and play some games over the weekend if you can. I don't think we spoke about this last week, but Crucible of War Unlimited was announced recently, and it's going to be out in 5 weeks worldwide. So it has a worldwide release date of July 30th, which is really exciting. I think you can go out there and grab your Courage of Bladeholds, your Scaladas, Fine Centers, Gaze the Ages, Gorganian Tomes, whatever you're in need of that you might not be able to pick out from first edition. So some more Crucible cards into the world is going to be fantastic. And I believe there's 3 drops is what LSS have said. So initial drop July 30th, and then over August, September, there's going to be more drops of Crucible of War Unlimited hitting retailers around the world, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I know that I'm just excited for the health of the game with the release of Crucible Unlimited. I know it's like a big pain point for a lot of people in Europe and some of these regions that didn't really get it. So super excited for it to be, openly available for everyone.
Yeah, so hard to get cards, and the secondary market pricing on singles for Crucible for those chase cards, like your Courage of Bladeholds, Fine Centers, etc., makes it definitely a barrier. So I'm glad that we're going to have Unlimited so that people can just get cards they want to play. That's the main thing, right? If you're not a collector, you're a player, you just want you're fine with unlimited copies, so get them in the hands.
Mm-hmm. And also want to mention that we had our Shane versus Katsu sort of rematch of the Calling PTI event go up on Channel Fireball this week. So go check that out if you're interested. I know we're talking about Classic Constructed. That video is Classic Constructed. But next week we're going to be having maybe we'll stick with Blitz going forward, but we might switch over to Classic Constructed. We do have another Blitz video coming out, and that's going to be Prism versus Bolton, which a matchup is interesting, isn't it, Hayden?
Yeah, I actually had some fun. We played some games after we filmed that as well, which ended up quite even. But was a really I hadn't really touched Bolton or Prism so far in Blitz, so I had at least a little bit of fun.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be touching Prism again, but maybe it's got an appeal.
Yeah, and also we just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who checked out our first non-podcast content on the Arsenal Pass channel. We had a lot of responses to the video on our Classic Constructed chain deck tech that we did from the deck that a few of us played at the PTI. So that's something that we want to do more of going forward. We had some really positive responses about that. So We're actually going to be recording tomorrow a deck tech for Brendan's Kano that he's been playing through this season of Skirmish, that he's going to talk us through the reasons why he played certain cards, how he approached certain matchups, and what he kind of learned about the deck over the season. So you'll be able to, get all the insight from Brendan's 7 armories and 3 skirmishes a week.
Yeah, so I'm looking at my Excel sheet right now. So it's about 150 games in the past 2-3 weeks on the Kano. I have to say, there's going to be small spoiler. The deck that will be, on the video is not going to be 40 cards. So basically, I've changed the Kano deck I've changed it like 10 times, and there's so many cards and archetypes and different ways to take Kano that I don't know. It's weird. I don't think the best deck has actually been found yet. But I do strive to find the most consistent version of him. But right now I'm playing with like a really funky deck. I've actually cut out Lesson in Lava. I've got like 2 Cindering Foresight. And yeah, it's a ride.
Well, if you want to see exactly what that deck looks like, make sure to check out the video that'll be going up early next week and see all of Brendan's thought process there as well. And in terms of what we look at next, we'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Drop us a line, drop us a comment in this video or on the deck tech videos. Maybe you want to see Brendan talk about Prism. I'm sure he'd love to. Livia, maybe Bravo. What format would you like to see? So just let us know. We'll try and make it happen.
Yep. And just want to mention that we are affiliated with Channel Fireball these days. So if you are shopping on Channel Fireball for singles or sealed product, there is I think it's just it's not a discount code section, but just like a coupon. Yeah, affiliate code section. So if you want to shoot our code in there, it's Arsenal Pass. That is the show name, Arsenal Pass with no space. We'd really appreciate it. But with that, Hayden, why don't you take us into the main topic of the pod?
Yep, let's do it. We've already talked a little bit about some prelude to this with the Blitz Skirmish Season 2 wrapping up with your experience on Kano. We've talked a little bit about, we put up a video the other week with some gameplay on Classic Constructed. And this is, something that I think, Brendan and I both feel is a pretty important topic. As the game grows, many players have been introduced as, Blitz being the primary format of Flesh and Blood, or the first format that they get to play, possibly alongside with Sealed and Draft maybe. And while Blitz is, it's a great format. It's fantastic for local events, for things like Armouries and Skirmishes. It's quick fire. Classic Constructed really is where these larger scale events are going to be focused moving forward, with callings, Road to Nationals, and Pro Tours around the world, in the near future. But jumping into Classic can be a little bit daunting, especially if Blitz has been your learning experience so far. And I definitely want to make, there's no mistake to be made. There's a huge difference in these two formats and a real learning curve that can come with making that jump. So we want to spend some time today going over exactly what those differences are and share ways that we believe you can make that transition easier on yourself and set yourself up for success with that move from Blitz to Classic Constructed. So Brendan, let's take a step back first of all, and what are the differences between Blitz and Classic Constructed from a pure structure perspective? I know Brendan wants me to maybe talk to the numbers, but can you tell us a bit about what the actual difference is?
Oh, I'm happy you asked, Hayden. No, so I mean, I just want to just quickly talk about it before we jump into the numbers. Is that the game is balanced for Classic Constructed. Classic Constructed is the intended format of Flesh and Blood and the most pure format. So it does feel significantly different from Blitz, and that is just from a macro gameplay standpoint, not even the pre-boarding. But getting into it, Classic Constructed is 80 cards plus 1, which is your hero. The time limit is 60 minutes, I believe. It's not 50, right, Hayden?
It's 50.
Yeah, it's 50.
Yeah.
I told Hayden, I was like, I'm not the guy to when they call time in the round, I just start playing on my turns. But I talked about pre-board. So there is a pre-board setup. You do get around, I think it's 5 minutes max to do this. So basically, like you do in Blitz, before you reveal your armor, you sit in front of your opponent, you see what hero they're on, and you can swap cards in and out. And what your, if you want to call it a sideboard, what your sideboard is, right?
Yeah. So
and then go ahead.
Yeah. So you have the 80 cards total, but you need to present a minimum 60 card deck for every single game to your opponent during that pre-game procedure. So, you have those extra 20 cards effectively to put whatever you want in there, whether that be the equipment. So obviously you want your minimum 4 equipment plus your weapons. That's 5 cards already gone. So you got 15 other cards to work with. That could be spare equipment. In Blitz you have access to exactly 11 pieces of equipment and weapons. You put extra equipment and weapons in your class constructor deck, you're starting to take up slots. So that's obviously a big consideration.
Yeah, that is kind of the dance there, is how many cards will you bring in that are going to be optional cards that come in versus certain heroes, and then how many pieces of armor you're going to be running, because you have to get that full suite of null rune, and there's always optional things like tunic versus a heart and cross strap in a more aggressive matchup, all these kind of crazy things.
So, Brendan, if we look through, a game of Classic Constructed and Blitz, other than, the time limit, so 50 minutes versus a 30-minute round, the pre-game procedure involves, cards out of main deck, not just your equipment. Any other high-level differences between Classic Constructed and Blitz before we actually get into the key of what makes this format so different?
Yeah, Hayden. So in Classic Constructed, there's a lot more creativity, I think, on the player's end. A lot more strategies can be employed. Obviously, there's a lot more turns. You're at a higher life total. There's more cards in the deck. So Blitz, I think, can be a bit linear, especially with heroes like Ira and Dorinthia being a bit constricting, and obviously Kano as well, forcing you to put blues in your deck. In Classic, this isn't so much the case. You'll see aggro Katsu, control Katsu, boost dash mech, control mech, all sorts of archetypes and different heroes at play. And the way the game is designed, I think that every hero is pretty much A tier viable. I hate to use any kind of tier section or say that anything is bad, but it's much more easier to kind of pick that hero that you identify with and take that into class constructed and be successful than it is to commit to a hero blindly, bring it into Blitz and be successful in that sort of environment.
Yeah, and a big part of that is those extra 20 cards that you have available to you, which, once you take your equipment and weapons out, ends up being basically a 15-card sideboard option. Because, if you take a deck into Blitz, you say, okay, I want to beat Ira. So maybe you look at, and Viscerai is your favorite hero. And we've seen these builds, these Viscerai OTK builds, right? That were quite popular initially in Skirmish Season 1 when to combat Ira. You have a 40 cards that's just purely dedicated to beating one deck, but then you come up against something like a Kano or a different deck in the format and you just fold, right? Because your deck just cannot handle it. Classic Constructed, you have this opportunity to use your additional 15 cards to change your game plan or change your deck in some way so that you don't just automatically fold a matchup, right? So there's a lot of strategic differences. So to get into it, basically what we felt we wanted to do is we wanted to split this into sort of 3 important sections when we talk about the differences between Blitz and Classic Constructed and making that transition, and 3 areas that you can really focus in on to make that, that transition easier, but where you can really find some edges to gain some success in Classic Constructed as you move over. So those are, one of them is deck building. The other one is actually game setup, so how you set up a game. And we'll get into a little bit what that means as we get into it. And then the third is the actual gameplay. So we're going to go through each of these. We're going to start with deck building, Brendan. Of course, we already know, so you have an 80-card shell. You have 80 cards to work with. Brendan, how are you actually looking at your decks when you're trying to decide these 80 cards? In Blitz, you just have 40 cards. Those are the cards I'm playing. With an 80-card shell, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, so there is a strategy that's employed by, I think, most Flesh and Blood players, which is they will have like Hayden, I think you mentioned it, a shell, right? Mm-hmm. So it's 60 card minimum. Generally, the shell is not 60 cards. It's going to be something like 54 or 57, or it really doesn't matter. But basically, your core shell is, what is my deck trying to do? And what are what's the minimum cards I need in my deck to make that game plan unfold? What are the decks that are always going to be in for every single matchup, and then you kind of keep that, and that's like your solid 54, or like I said, or 57, and then the rest is sideboard stuff, like it comes in. So every single match you're bringing something in, right? And it could be something that's maybe not so consequential, right? Like if you're going up against a Kano, maybe you bring in the Arena's Prayers. But if you're going up against a Warrior, maybe you're just adding more, I don't know, more mech cards to your deck because you want to just be more consistent. Mm-hmm. But I think that this is the easiest way to kind of prepare for a match, right? And then you can have that piece of paper, that sideboard plan, and just, as soon as you start the match, you go to your pre-board, you slot in the cards, you're good to go.
Yeah.
That's my method.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack there, and I think the first thing you talk about is that core, that I like to call it a core anyway, of your deck that you're going to play in every single matchup. You said 54, 57. I've played as low as 45 cards in my core, and what we really mean by that core is that all those cards work together in harmony to do one thing. So it's your core game plan, and these 45 to 57 cards help you execute that. And then the remainder cards allow you to either bring cards in, as Brendan said, to just supplement their plan. You get to 60 cards for just your sort of bog standard matchup, or you've got cards in your sideboard that actually allow you to maybe change your game plan. So say you have a 50 card core, you might bring 10 cards in that completely change the way you play. They could be 10 defense reactions. Now you've gone from a really aggressive deck to a deck that wants to utilize those defense reactions and then set up your deck for late game, as opposed to it could be 5 more aggressive cards plus 3 whatever from your sideboard that allows you to be more aggressive. So it really depends on your core, but that's the most important thing. I think everyone, when deck building and classic construction, should start with that core, because it allows you to basically have a really focused game plan, and you just put all the noise to the side to start with. And your core game plan could be, I want to beat X deck, I want to beat Chain and Classic Constructed, or I want to be the most aggressive as possible, or I want to be as controlling as possible, and then you just go from there.
Yeah, one thing that's really cool that we'll see as well is that in Classic Constructed, decks will be multiple, we'll have the functionality to be multiple archetypes. You saw us a lot with Control Dash, but Control Dash in some mashups would side in enough cards to where it would essentially become mid-range Dash. Back at the Calling New Zealand, so the first constructed calling for Welcome to Wraith, when we were playing Ninja Control, we had a bunch of accelerator cards for Swiss. So we had these Razor Reflexes, these Snatch. These cards that just kind of sucked in the deck. The entire deck was just based around Jonas Brutality and Fatiguing, but we had to win our matches in a certain amount of time. But when we got to top 8, we subbed out a ton of cards, and we just paid a 60 shell, and it was very lean and just executed that one game plan, which is Jonas Brutality. That ended up taking 1.5 to 2 hours, but the entire archetype changes. And I think it's really interesting.
Yep, with just a few cards, right? Because all cards have functionality, and almost all cards have multiple functions in Flesh and Blood, whether it be to provide you resources, to be defensive or be offensive, or supplement game plan, things like non-attack actions. So because of that, a way a certain card can play in your core of your deck in one game might be completely different to another game because of how you change your actual 60 cards that you then end up presenting to your opponent. And I think a good example of this is you could have something, an Invert Existence in Chain, for instance. That could be purely a blue against Kano that you just used to pitch. It's never hitting anything, but it gives you the opportunity to go up to your blue count higher. Or in certain matchups, that could actually be a win condition that you pitch early and come back to be able to kill them. Or it could just purely be 2 damage. So there's certain ways that cards play in maybe a core, or the reasons you bring them in. But the most important thing I really just can't stress it enough, I think, is just start with that core of a deck. It's the best way to build Classic Constructed, is start with that core, focus game plan, and then work out the rest of the stuff from there. Because if your core game plan doesn't work to start with, there's no point in thinking about 80 cards as a total, because the deck's just not going to work to start with.
Yeah, and Hayden, I want to ask you a question I think is going to be on a lot of listeners' minds, which is, we talk about it being 60 card minimum and technically 80 card total, right? So how many cards do you play in your deck? Do you play 60 every time, or how does that work out?
Yeah, it depends, but I think my goal always is to play 60. I need to have a reason to play more than 60. I think when the game first came out, so when we were talking about the Welcome to Wraith meta, you were just talking about that decks played over 60 cards, and there was a good reason for that, was that fatigue was really possible in that format because the power level of cards and synergies was a lot lower. As sets have come out, we've had Crucible as that first supplementary set, then we've had Monarch. There's this ability to really produce big, powerful turns. And for that reason, I want to keep as close to 60 as possible unless I have a reason to. I know a deck like Chain, for instance, might want to play 64, 65 cards in some matchups because fatigue's an issue, right? Or you could run out of cards with Vanishing. But if you don't have a reason to do it, you basically shouldn't be running more than 60. You want to have a tight package of your most powerful cards for any given matchup in that 60, and any cards you put in over that is now just cards you're drawing that aren't cards you want to see effectively. Think about, let's take an example, right? You're a Guardian playing into Warrior. if you're not worried about fatigue in that matchup, then you have no reason to play more than 60, because every card you put in over 60 that isn't, say, a defense reaction, you're now taking away your opportunities to draw your really important defense reactions in that matchup.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, it's the sort of same deck building kind of tenets as a lot of other games, is that you want to be as consistent as possible, unless you're forced not to. If you're worried
Yeah.
about fatigue or worried about other, I guess there'd be some other niche scenarios where it might be possible. But I want to talk about this sideboard a bit, or this the pre-board, the sideboard, or whatever you want to call it. This is kind of where Classic Construct shines. In Blitz, we have a lot of matchups that are extremely unfavorable, right? You have your 40 cards; it can never change, and sometimes you have cards in that deck that are literally just for one matchup, right? You have a bunch of heroes that you could potentially face, but you end up just playing 2 Sigil of Solaces to increase your Kano matchup, where you have this many blues to increase your Kano matchup. But in Classic Constructed, you can have certain cards that will be extremely bad versus specific heroes. Let's talk about I think it's Alrina's Prayer, the one that's just for arcane damage. Incredibly bad versus anything that's not Kano. But you can have it in your sideboard and you can bring it in specifically for that matchup and target that hero.
Yeah, exactly. If you feel that's a matchup that you're soft to, then you can almost play. Arrow's Prayer is actually an interesting one because it is a card that's really specific, and a lot of cards in Flesh and Blood aren't actually that specific. And what I mean is that it's almost like what you might term in some of the games like a hate card, right? Like it has one function, whereas most cards in Flesh and Blood don't actually have just one function. Often what you need to do in order to target a deck is to change the way that your deck operates, right? So you might need like 10 cards out of your pre-board or sideboard to change the way you play in a certain matchup. Like against Warrior, you might need more defense reactions to be able to stave off them getting counters while you enact your own plan. Whereas Prayer is a little bit different because it's just one card that can blow up a whole turn, basically. But yeah, you can use these sideboard options to your advantage. You can change your deck in the way you need to. So that's another reason why I think it's so important to start with that core, because if the core of your deck doesn't function, there's no point in even having those cards. You're not going to be able to win a game even if you have those sort of hate cards or ways to change your strategy, because you don't even have a core to start with.
Yeah, I just want to quickly talk about sideboard preparation as well. So the way that I like to do it is, we've touched on it enough, is obviously have the core, but then on a piece of paper or a notebook, I'll write out every single potential matchup and just put in, +2 energy potion, +3 crippling crush, et cetera, et cetera. Write down the cards I'm going to add in, do it for every single hero. And then when I show up on the day, I'm not looking through my sideboard, kind of wondering, this is good, maybe it's not. No, I've got a plan. I'm ready to commit, and it's just easy. Slot in, like we talked about. You only got 5 minutes. Slot it in, shuffle it up. You're good to go.
Yeah, that's
the way I like to do that.
That's a great point as well, and a lot of people may not know this, but you can actually take sideboard notes with you. So you can prepare your notes, as Brendan said. You can take those with you, and during pre-game procedure. So if you're not familiar with exactly what pre-game procedure is, that's you sit down at the table. Both players flip up their hero, so you know which hero each player is playing, and now pre-game procedure starts. That includes sideboarding, choosing your equipment and weapon, selecting those. Keep those face down so your opponent doesn't see them, and then you can look at those notes all the way up until you've finished shuffling and ready to present your deck. That's when pre-game procedure ends. So you have to put those notes away. You can't be looking at any notes during the actual game itself, but pre-game procedure is okay. So you've shuffled up, you've chosen your equipment, you've chosen your sideboard cards, you've got what cards you've left in the deck box, and then put those notes away, present, and you've obviously flip up your equipment and you're ready to go. So couldn't agree more. I always do it as well. I always write out my matchups, and the other reason I do it is because it tells me what cards I have in my deck that actually I thought might be important. But now that I look at it and start going through my game plan for each matchup, some of them might actually be useless or not doing the job I need them to do. I might have put cards in my sideboard in theory for one matchup, but they come in no other matchup. So is it worth me dedicating slots to that card, or could I be going back to the drawing board a little bit and looking at maybe some of my other matchups where on paper I'm going, I'm having to sideboard in this card because I just have to, I have nothing else. But I actually use those slots where I've got a card for Azalea, for instance, that I maybe need another card for Chain, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I remember pretty recently I was building a constructed deck for our locals, and I wrote down all of them, and I looked at my sideboard, and there was 3 cards that I just never put in any matchup. I was like, oh, well, I guess I don't need these.
Yeah, it's such a great way to do it, honestly. I love documenting things, whether that be, like you say, with writing stuff down as I'm building, or even I like physical cards. I know FabDB is a great resource, for instance, but you might be using something like more physical cards, and I like to sometimes just like take photos of my sideboard plan for each, and then afterwards just go back through them, look at my main deck, look at the sideboard options, and just like, am I happy with that? Does the 60 cards I end up with actually do what I need it to do in that matchup, or have I just got cards in there that don't need to be there, or they need to be something else?
Yeah. So we touched on it a bit, and this is going to be kind of our second main point, but it's going to be game setup, and this is really important in Classic Constructed. So I know we talked about not you put everything face down, you kind of do your pre-boarding, but Classic is a lot different because, like, say I bring the Shane deck, right? I put my Shane down, I look on the other side of the table, it's Katsu. I now have to make a decision, right? I don't, let's say we have no information, right? It's like the first match of a tournament. I don't know if that's control Katsu or if that's aggro Katsu. And it drastically changes the way I'm going to pre-board my deck and my entire strategy. So that's something that's way different about Class Constructed, is that you can sit in front of a hero and their game plan is not going to be immediately clear to you. You can guess it, but there could be multiple ways that that class or hero deck could be played against you.
Yeah, it's so true. It's one of the hardest bits about this game is people can be creative and they can play things in ways you might not expect. I know early on in Welcome to Wraith format, someone sat down with Katsu, you're like, okay, this is an aggro matchup. And then when someone starts, playing unmovables and has lots of blues and is trying to fatigue you, you sort of go, okay, well, what's happening here? And so it's really important during the setup that you're prepared for whatever it is you think that could eventuate. So if you're 80, you can be really confident that actually, in fact, this is an aggro Katsu deck. So you're going to set your deck up for that matchup with your sideboard notes you've got, with the way that you want to play the matchup. But sometimes for me, for instance, when I sit down and I have that, if there's like a 20% chance I think that could be a control deck, I might hedge my sideboard a little bit. I might bring in some cards that I think are better against a control deck, but if I draw them against the aggro, they're not just going to be purely detrimental to me winning the game. I think about cards like maybe it's a card like Springboard Somersault. So if they're aggressive, that card's really important. But if they're defensive, at least it still pitches for yellow to give me resources, whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely.
The pregame setup also is why some more than one equipment option can be a good option sometimes, but it can also be, you got to be careful about redundancy, right? You've only got 15 or extra cards there to play with, so you have to be really careful about what those cards are. So if you're using a lot of those slots for extra equipments, that could be really detrimental to the core of your deck and what you're trying to do. So it's really important that when you think about the actual deck building side, you think about the meta you expect, so that when you come to the game, you just know what equipment are coming in, and you're not you don't have extra equipment just for the sake of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like we talked about as well, I just want to quickly remind is that because this does happen a lot, especially like calling level tournaments. The time you have to kind of present your deck, set up, add in your sideboard, and all that stuff is not much. And the sooner you get done with it, kind of the better. So I would just very, very much recommend that you come prepared, your matchups, and you make that process as quick as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And it saves you the mental thought process, right? You actually save some mental capacity, some energy, because you're not having to sit down and already immediately start thinking like, oh gosh, like what if this, what if that? You just have this plan set out. It's like, okay, I have a plan for aggro Katsu, I have a plan for control Katsu, and I have a plan if I'm unsure, if I think they could be either. I've got that written down. I've got my sideboard notes. I just slam the equipment down, face down, ready to go. I've got the 60 minimum that I know I want to play in their matchup. And you've just, you're 2-3 minutes into it already, but you've shuffled up ready to go. And you can actually start thinking about the game itself as opposed to just thinking about purely the cards and the equipment you have to bring in. So you just save so much energy.
Yeah, and I think this one is going to be a bit obvious for a lot of people, but if you are running that core deck, say it's the 54 cards, if I finished a match, say I will side out the cards that I put in for that specific matchup and keep that 54 core. So when I sit down in front of a new hero, I don't have to, go search through my deck and figure out which ones I added, take them out. No, they're in a separate section. My core deck is there. I see the new matchup. I pull from my sideboard, saw the new card, shuffle up, good to go.
Yep. Use that little divider. It's way easier if you just do it post game, so that you finish at the table. Might be 10 minutes left in the round. You take a minute to de-sideboard. Then you can go walk around, be relaxed, and then when you get to your next match, you're not already eating into your 50-minute time trying to take the cards out, searching through your deck multiple times. You're getting a bit flustered. It's just already there sorted. So you want to basically be as efficient as possible. Flesh and Blood events are long. Especially if you're playing Classic Constructor where there's 50-minute rounds, you might be going to 30, 40, even up to that time in certain matchups. So, you want to make sure that you're expelling as little mental energy as possible when you're saving it all up for the top 8.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hayden, why don't you take us into our final section here? Talk to me about gameplay.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked about setting up the game, and that leads perfectly into starting to play the game. So you've done your sideboarding, you've built your deck, you're ready to go at the event. There's some things that are really important in Classic Constructor and differ to Blitz. So, you already spoke about this a bit, Brendan, but Blitz is a lot more linear in terms of the gameplay aspects. You probably know exactly what your opponent's going to do. You know what you're going to do. But there's not necessarily the same in Classic Constructed. So I want to start with some facts, right? We've got some facts about Classic Constructed, and we already spoke about some of these, but there's more turns. There's going to be, on average, a lot more turns in Classic Constructed because the resources you start with are higher. So your deck count is higher, your life total is higher. So your actual, and those are both resources in Flesh and Blood, right? So your cards and your life total. So there's going to be more turns in the game. You're actually going to have reduced variance in general. I would say this is not always exactly true, but in general, you can have less variance or reduced variance because of there's more turns in the game. So you can actually play your way out of situations where maybe you do get a little bit unlucky. Maybe on the first draw through, you draw a quad red hand, and your deck can't operate without a blue in hand. That sucks. And in Blitz, that could be really detrimental to the entire game. In Classic Constructed, because you have the 40 life to play with and the 60 card deck, you can actually play your way out of that. One turn where you lose a turn cycle isn't the end of the game. Pitching is so much more important in Classic Constructed than it is in Blitz. In Blitz, you're in a lot of matchups, you're very unlikely to see back through your pitch. In Skirmish Season 1, this wasn't necessarily the case with a lot of Ira Mirrors and Drone of Brutality. You could actually pretty feasibly get back through your deck. That's not so much the case now, as my experience. I'm sure, Brendan, you'd be able to comment on this, but in Skirmish Season 2, a lot of games are only lasting 2, 3, 4 turns.
Yeah, it's much faster now. I might be a little biased because I'm playing Kano, but even the Ira decks are faster. Literally everything is faster. There is probably more Bravos nowadays in Skirmish Season 2, which leads to some longer games. So I still think it's important to keep that in mind if you're playing against a slower deck or you are playing a slower deck. But yes, in Classic Constructed, you will likely cycle through your deck multiple times unless the opponent is on an incredibly aggressive strategy or you are yourself.
Yeah, you exactly right. You're generally going to get through it because you've got 20 more cards, but double the life. So it's very likely. So in terms of how you set up your game is more important. You can actually run out of damage in Classic Constructed, though. Like I say, you get 20 more cards, but there's double the life. So if you are really, and this is something I'm not sure if you've experienced this much, Brendan, but I remember playing sort of like Katsu aggro decks in like Crucible meta, and if people were really on top of it and really defensive, they could actually run me out of red cards, out of damage effectively, because there's only so much in your deck, right? And you have to get through 40 life. So if they're able to block out with their bad cards into my good cards, I could actually run out of damage. And it is something that can happen. Could happen with Chain, for instance. You could run out of important blood deck cards like Red Rift Binds and things like that.
Yeah, I think I can totally speak to this, but my example would be Welcome to Wraith Constructed, where we played Control Katsu with Drone. It was literally all about just running the opponent out of threats and red cards. So playing that deck, if the opponent came in with let's say a red Surging Strike as a Ninja Mirror, and you blocked with 2 blues, I mean you get 2 for 1, right? But it's a win for you because those blues don't matter at all to our deck. It literally just goes to Drone of Brutality. That's the only card that matters. For the mid-range Ninja on the other side, once they run out of Surging Strikes, that kind of sucks. So yeah, I mean, the threat density of your deck is incredibly important. This happens as Blitz kind of as well. Is that if you are planning to go to a late game, you need to make sure that you like literally have enough damage to kill the opponent. You haven't pitched all blues, which sometimes people will do. But yeah, especially in classic constructed, the threat density and the power of your deck is a dynamic thing that fluctuates throughout the game, and you might kind of run yourself to a state where it's literally impossible for you to win because you don't have enough damage.
Yeah, unless you're maybe running the trusty romping club, you could be in trouble. And you can also fatigue as well, which of course you can in Blitz. And it probably happens, I would say, at the same rate. It's more around what we just talked about, is that running out of damage. That's a real thing. Like maybe even take something like a Dorinthia deck, for instance. You could run out of all your Warriors, Valors, and red attack reactions, and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Your opponent can look through your graveyard, know what you've got left once you get through that second cycle of the deck, and just play you out of the game, basically, because you just don't have damage left to force them to do anything. They can keep their good cards. So yeah, the lining up of good cards and bad cards is really important in that regard. So there's some facts about what the difference is between Blitz and Classic Constructed. So what does that mean? What are some tips or some ways that you can gain an edge moving into Classic Constructed? So I think one thing I want to start with, Brendan, is that be ready to adapt your game plan on the fly. We talked about, in pre-game procedure, you're going to have an idea of how you want to play a game because you've prepped your sideboard notes, you've prepped your core of your deck and your sideboard to be able to head into any matchup. But say, let's use our example from before. Say you're against a Katsu, you're prepped for an aggro deck, they end up being a control deck. It's time to adapt your game plan on the fly. If you just run your game plan that you had against aggro into it, it's probably not going to go very well. You need to start immediately thinking about how you might need to play this game differently. So that could come down to how you pitch differently. Let's say against an aggro deck, you want to just put as much pressure on them as possible while defending out. So you're like, okay, defend with 2 cards, swing back with 2 important cards out of my hand. Whereas if you do that into a control deck, they're probably pretty happy with that. They get to just throw, like you say, use the example before, they get to throw blue cards and cards they don't care about, your good cards, and then eventually run you out of threats. So, the way you might adapt your game plan, in fact, is, okay, well, actually, I'm going to utilize my weapons a lot more. I'm going to use my blues to attack with, and I'm going to pitch my my good red cards for gas later in the game, because as a control deck, they can't actually put that much pressure on me to threaten me anyway. I'm going to get back to that part of my deck.
Yep, and what I love about this concept is that it gets even more advanced and complicated. So we had Kieran on the podcast last week, but he mentioned a situation where he did this at probably the most complicated and highest level, right? So he sat down at the finals of the calling, ended up against Katsu control. He wasn't ready for that matchup, probably didn't sideboard correctly. But anyway, he kind of figures out what's going on 5-6 turns into the game. But what happened is that, aside from kind of running out your threats and making sure you kind of still have reds in the deck when you're circling back through, because that matchup would go through 5 or 6 times through the deck, there was actually only one conceivable way for Kieran to win that game, which he had to recognize really early, because it involved his Snapdragon Scalers. He talked to us about it. He had to fill up his graveyard with a bunch of Surging Strikes, Whelming Gust Waves, and all that. And then he needed to save 1 Mugenshi release, play Mugenshi, Snapdragon, Lord of Wind, put all the stuff back in his deck, and make a big Lord of Wind turn. And he would have actually won versus the Katsu drone deck. And this is something that it was so critical to him winning the game, but he had to realize it so early and play. It was just would have changed his game plan so much. And that's my favorite example by far, with changing on the fly, because that's not a game plan he would have employed versus anybody else, or probably had ever done in the past.
Yep. Yeah. It's so important. If your opponent comes into a game and they think you're going to play a certain way, and then you play that certain way, it's going to be beneficial for them, right? Because they are expecting that. If you come into a game, expect your opponent to play a certain way, and then they don't, and then you adapt the way you're playing, now they don't know how you're going to play either. So you're helping your advantage in the game. You work it out on the fly. And look, it's not always going to be right. I've definitely had situations where I try and adapt on the fly, and I probably end up in a worse position. But at least I learned from it, right? So I think it's it's the important thing, is I learn from it, and then I go away. Maybe we play again in the top 8, and I've thought about how I want to play that matchup, and can be ready for it.
Yeah, I definitely feel that in the Shane deck. You're like, oh, I'm going to get fatigued. Okay, so I'll try to stop soul shackling now. You're at like 3, and then you end up burning all of your dimensional crossroads anyway, and you're like, oh crap. So you would have had to kind of start that from the beginning. So yeah, sometimes you can realize a little too late, and it does actively hurt your chance of winning when you switch.
Yep. The other thing we talked about is more turns, right? So you cycle through the deck more. Use that to your advantage. When you start to there's two bits to this. So one is your opponent's side and one's your side. The first one is your side. So as you cycle through the game and you're pitching, be aware of what you are pitching and what the turns are going to look like when you come back to. We talk about this all the time. You're pitching to win. It's really important, and no more so than in Classic Constructed. Make sure you've got the setups. But the other thing you can do is you can also be just looking at what's left for your opponent. If your plan is to pitch to late and get to the end game, that's awesome. But what's your opponent doing? Look at if they've got a bunch of gas still left in their deck, you're going to face the same problem at the end of the game. They're going to have gas. You're going to have gas. So it's just you can use those turns to your advantage, and that goes back to our first point. You might actually change your game plan to start trying to put a bit more pressure on them in the mid game if you think that they're just going to start drawing blues or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in Classic Constructed and a lot of less aggressive matchups, your opponent will sort of actively display to you how they're going to win the game by the way they pitch and what cards are left in their deck. So it's definitely an interesting, kind of end game scenarios are very dynamic and changing in Classic, and you can play into and play around what your opponent is trying to do in order to win.
Yeah, and you can, as I say, you can adapt to that, right? So, I think of a matchup where I was playing Rhinar. So just before Monarch came out, playing Rhinar into a Bravo deck. So in that matchup, I felt that I couldn't wait around too long, or my opponent would start, spinal crushing me and just all these crush effects to destroy me. So I actually felt that I couldn't pitch to late game. My opponent could see that I was being pretty aggressive with the deck, pitching a lot of blues and things like that. So the bottom of my deck wasn't looking too good. And my opponent actually adapted to try and just get through, like block as much damage out early so that they could get through to the late game if they could. And then on the flip side of that, I had to then adapt my strategy to then start pitching a few cards towards the late game. Otherwise, I was going to have no chance of winning that game. So you can just adapt these things on the fly just by keeping your eye out, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of anything else, I think one thing, and this is kind of all-encompassing, but it's just recognizing the early, mid, and late game. I think it's quite defined in Classic Constructed. Early game, I would really define as that first big portion of cycling through your deck. The mid game is once you get through to probably the late section of cycling through your deck. Mid game is through the late section of your deck, and then once you get into the late game, you really are back through cycling your deck. And it's just important to recognize where you are at each of these points. If you've got a strategy where it's get to the late game, pitch to win, get all these important sort of pieces that work together. Maybe in something like Rhinar, it might be Blood Rush Bellows plus an Art of War or really good cards at the bottom of your deck. If you're really behind as you get into the mid game, how are you going to execute your late game if you have no life left to do it? So it's just really important that you identify each of these phases of the game and work out how you're going to play in each of them, because you're going to know that, say you're a late game deck, but you're behind in the mid game, you're going to have a very tough time getting to that late game to start with.
For sure.
Is there anything you like to do in terms of, reevaluating the game as it goes, Brendan? In Classic Constructed, obviously, we talked about more turns. There's lots of things happening. If you are through a game, is there sort of signposts you're looking for in that game to work out where you might be trying to gauge? Because life isn't always the only thing that tells you where you are in a game, right? You could be down in life, you could be ahead on life. What are things you're looking out for?
Yeah, so I've played mostly Shane, right? In this Classic Constructed since Mono came out. So as Shane, it's important for me to kind of realize what's left in my deck at any point in time. I usually don't really get back to my pitch. So kind of checking my graveyard, checking my Banish Zone for my Art of Wars, for my Plunder runs, realizing, am I going to have a turn left in this game where I can come in for more than 12 damage? So like if I'm getting to a game state where I'm supposing that the opponent's just going to try to fatigue me out, and I've soul shackled like 6 times, I'm pretty much screwed either way. But mentally, I'm going to go and look are there any cards left in my deck which are going to allow me to pull off turns that are more than 12 damage, the kind of max they could block out of hand. We're going to assume their armor is gone at this point. There's no defense reactions. So yeah, I'm going to look to actively set up a very large turn so I can kill them. So I had a match last week actually that was really interesting because my opponent initially was on Bravo. I was on Shane. Initially tried to trade dams with me, crushed me back to back to back, and then decided once they're at around 20 life that they were just going to fatigue me. And of course, at this point, I have five soul shackles. Well, my dimensional crossroads are essentially useless. I've got Carrion Husk probably already in the banish zone, so those cards are dead. So what I did, because I was on higher life, is that every single time I would get like a seeds or a non-attack action in my banish zone, I just left it there. Ended up taking around 15 damage, but just played to those rift binds, and then ended up hitting him for over 30 damage to kill him with 2 huge rift bind turns. No, sorry, 1 huge rift bind turn, but 2 huge rift binds.
That's a perfect example of adapting the game plan, right? And also one thing that we didn't touch on as much, but just playing to your outs, right? Like you get into that early, mid, or late game, whatever it might be of those sections of the game, and you might be behind. So if you can just take 30 seconds, work out what your actual outs are, and then you got to play to those. That's the most important thing. I think you'd be surprised how often you look at a game state and go, oh, well, this game's surely over. But there's ways to get out of it with Classic Constructed because of those high life totals, because of those high card counts in the deck.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is like a general Flesh and Blood concept as well that I've always pushed to improve upon because I know I didn't naturally had it. But a lot, and especially Classic Constructed, you're always you're kind of in the game even when you're significantly behind, and no matter how bad it really looks, you can always play to that 1%, to that 2%, to that 5% out. And you're going to be a better player for it at the end of the day. You're not going to really learn anything by conceding, by giving up early, by sort of mentally checking out. And I think always playing for that win, especially in Classic, you'll be surprised with how many times you're able to kind of pull through.
Yeah, you might not win that game, but you're going to play to your outs and you're going to learn something, right? You might end up playing to a certain out and then working out halfway through that I could have played to this other out. Well, next time I'm going to make sure that I do that. You can actually learn something from the game. Whereas, if you say you mentally check out, what are you going to learn? Nothing.
No.
It's just going to be a bit painful. So just a couple of last things before we wrap up. We might also just recap some of these key sort of tips on transitioning from Blitz to Classic that we've talked about. But just a couple of things we didn't cover. In Classic Constructed, because of this, we talked about the concept of a core deck and your sideboarding options. Test, where you can and learn not just about the cards specifically, but about matchups and how you can make small adjustments to those matchups. You might play one matchup, come away from it and go, actually, I have these other cards in my sideboard for another matchup, but maybe they might actually be quite good here as well. Let's bring these in and test those as well. So you can make all these small adjustments and it can actually change your deck quite significantly. So, give it a go, test and learn as much as possible. The other thing as well is that we talked about this, right? You have 40 life and you have 60 cards. So there's so much more creativity to be had. You don't have to play as linear. So go and explore that, find ways to make it different or to try things that maybe you wouldn't try in Blitz because you just know it's not going to be possible with the short length of the game. You don't have to worry about a Kano killing you on the second turn. You have a bit more time. So play around with some stuff. People initially took Katsu as an aggro deck, and then people realized actually you can play this as a control deck. So play around and see what you can find. Any other kind of general tips, Brendan?
Yeah, so I'm going to let you circle us back through, kind of touch on everything, summarize it, but we're going to do a little bonus section here. So generally our episodes are pretty future-proofed. We kind of talk about a lot of fundamentals and theory, but I know a lot of you listen week to week, and a lot of people will have this question in their mind. Hayden, you play a lot of Classic Constructed. I played a bit as well. What does the meta look like? What are you playing? And what's the deck to beat?
Yeah, okay. Great question. I think you can't go past Chain right now as the deck to beat. It's been a great hero for the early part of the meta. It was when it was spoiled, I think there was a lot of hype around obviously what it can do with playing from Banish, and that's a really powerful effect. So it's a deck that can do a lot, and it's a really proactive deck. So it's a really great deck for an early format. It's the deck that I've been playing quite a bit. We tried to tune it as much as possible, along with what you'd given us, Brendan, for the PTI, and to beyond with events coming up. The meta at the moment, I would say, is kind of going to start to be warped by Chain. I would say initially it was just what are the new stuff, right? So Chain, Prism, those were like the two most played decks, I think. But now Chain is sort of emerging as probably the powerhouse in the early phase of the format. So we're starting to see really the meta warp towards that. We saw that Katsu mid-range sort of control deck take out the PTI with the strategy of fatiguing Chain. We're probably going to start to see things like Bravo with really specific game plans against Chain. We might see Dorinthias or Boltons with specific game plans into Chain. It's just going to warp how people probably deck build. And I think that's, to be honest, kind of a good thing. I think it's great if we have a meta that evolves and adapts. So, right now it could be Chain. In 2 weeks' time, it could be all about these more sort of, I guess, either really hyper aggro decks that try and punish the deck with on-hit effects, or these decks that maybe try and fatigue it. And then the meta then again changes to combat those decks. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll see a sort of a meta rebound very, very soon. Like there was one event, being the PTI of the Calling, that kind of asked people to innovate and create new decks. Since then, there's pretty much just been locals, so not too much of a motivator. So we seem like we've sat in a similar spot since then. What I'm seeing is a lot of Shane, a lot of Bravo, and people now kind of coming off Prism. But yeah, I think that the thing about Flesh and Blood, and I've thought this since the Welcome to Wraith meta, is that the best deck is almost universally never discovered. We just simply do not have enough players quite yet, and the deck building in this game is just incredibly complex because you have to sort of put your resource base as part of your entire deck, your threats. I mean, it's so much harder than I just slot in these 4 really, really good cards and I play around that card. That's not the case here. And so I think that there's as Road to Nats in the US is coming up. I think also maybe in some other regions that's going to push people to sort of bend this meta, and I don't think we're going to stay on Shane. He's a very powerful deck. It's a very dynamic deck, which is something that we've kind of found out as we've played it more. The deck can adapt to people trying to fatigue it. It can just play its standard aggro game plan. But I do think that, there's definitely, like, on the horizon, there's a deck that is just supremely better than that one that's out there. And like we talked about at the beginning of this section, the cool thing about Classic Constructed, and probably if you're a casual player, and it's even one of my favorite parts about Classic, is that you're not like pretty much every hero is viable, and you're not going to be heavily constricted, like where you can't play this game plan or can't play that game plan. You have the sideboard, you can bring cards in for specific matchups, but if you want to be a warrior player, you can be a warrior player. If you want to be a ranger player, you can be a ranger player, and you'll see a lot more success, right? There's going to be like a card like Flick Flack, which is just going to totally constrict the meta, right? You can bring in cards to tech against popular and powerful decks, and I think we're going to see a lot of change in the near future.
Yep. And before we just wrap around to recapping these points from the main topic, I just want to say just a quick plug for our deck tech that we did on the Chain deck. I think that is, to be honest, just the best deck for early part of this meta. Like you said, it's not linear. There's so many ways you can play the deck. It has power from turn 1. So if you are looking for a deck for the next couple of weeks, I think that's a perfect place to go. And then I would challenge everyone to, how do you innovate and beat on that? I think that's the next step.
Yeah. And I'll be waiting here with open arms, because the last thing I want to do is play Chain Mirrors.
I agree. It's horrendous. All right, we're just going to circle back around. So we talked about 3 sort of key sections and making that transition from Blitz to Classic Constructed, and ways that you can make it easier on yourself, get ahead. When we talked about deck building, which is the first kind of part of that, we really spoke about starting with that core of the deck. It's so important. Start with that 45 to 55 cards. There's no limit on what it looks like, but it should be the cards that just do the one job you need them to, the core of the deck. And then set yourself up from there with working out which cards you want to bring into that core to either change it, amplify it, or make it a bit different for certain matchups. You you can take a piece of paper with you to an event. You can take your sideboarding options with you to an event and write those down. So use it. You've got that in the rules. You're able to do that. Use it to your full advantage. Be prepared. You can use it. So then when you get into your game setup, you're already saving yourself time because you know exactly how you're going to play that. Think about in your game setup how you are going to play against a hero, whether that might be like a control version, a aggro version. Just have that in mind as you go is really important. We're up to Brendan. Gameplay. So in terms of gameplay, be ready to adapt your game plan on the fly. That's really important. Think about the packages that you have within your deck so that you can play to your outs and play to your key points in the game, whether it be the early, mid, or late game. And that can be done either by pitching for it or setting those up earlier, and then just recognizing what's happening in the game. Make sure you're always playing to those outs. Anything else, Brendan, that we didn't tie up there?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. I'm super excited to have Road to Nats hit, have Classic Constructed finally be the main format again. The format the game is balanced for. Blitz is great. Blitz is fun. It's fast. It's such a good format for what it tries to accomplish. But I know a lot of people do complain about variance, maybe a little bit more than they should in Blitz. But Classic Constructed is significantly lower variance. There is so much more creativity. You can really commit to your game plan and the way you want to play. And there's so much room for you to kind of work within the space. You're not going to be heavily constricted by by certain cards or certain decks as much as you would in Blitz. But with that, I think that we've covered it all. And this has been episode 11 of Arsenal Pass, transitioning from Blitz to Constructed. Thank you all so much for listening. We will see you next week.
Bye.